The clay tablet speaks in a language that has been silent for 4,000 years. Its message pressed into the earth of ancient Iraq is simple and profound. Before the Great Flood, kingship was lowered from heaven, and after the Great Flood swept over the land, kingship was lowered from heaven a second time. You're standing in a quiet, climate-controlled room. The air, sterile and cool, hums with a low electric stillness. This is not the sun-scorched plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, but a gallery in the British Museum, a library for things that have outlived their worlds. Before you, under a focused beam of light, rests a fragment of baked mud, the Weld-Blundell prism. It is a piece of the Sumerian King List. Your eyes follow the wedge-shaped whispers of cuneiform, a script so precise it seems less written and more engineered. You read the names of kings who ruled from cities whose dust has long since returned to the desert: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak. Then you see the numbers: a reign of 28,800 years, another of 36,000, and one, Alulim, the first king, who ruled for 8 Shah, a period of 28,800 years. Who were these kings? And what kind of history begins with an age of rulers who lived longer than our own species has known civilization? Hold that image in your mind. The stillness of the museum, the impossible numbers on the clay. Before we descend deeper into this quiet mystery, take a moment to settle back into the space you're in now. Feel the chair beneath you. Notice the quality of the light in your room. This is where our story begins. Wherever you're listening tonight, a late-night drive through the quiet hills of Kentucky, a high-rise apartment overlooking the lights of Singapore, a small room where the only sound is the rain against the window. Welcome to Sapiens Untold. In the comments, let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you. There is a certain kind of magic in knowing we are all here together, in this shared space, looking back into the deep past from our scattered points in the present. So get comfortable, dim the lights if you can. If you feel a pull towards these forgotten histories, towards the questions that echo from the ruins of civilizations we barely understand, consider hitting like and subscribing. It is the modern way of telling the world that these ancient whispers still have something important to say. Now. Let us return to that silent gallery in London. Let us lean closer to that piece of clay, to that impossible number that challenges everything we think we know about who we are and where we come from. The glass case in the museum vanishes. You're no longer in London. You're in a library of ghosts, a silent archive where history is kept. The air is still and smells of dry dust and time itself. The shelves are filled not with books, but with memories pressed into clay. Most are ledgers of grain, contracts for silver, the mundane pulse of a civilization learning to count its wealth. But one scroll of clay, unrolled in your mind's eye, is different. It is the King List. The orthodox view is simple. The early names are myth. They are symbolic, cosmological, a way for a young culture to invent a past of divine grandeur. The impossible numbers, the reigns lasting for millennia, are dismissed as priestly exaggerations or metaphors for power, but the clay doesn't lie. It remembers. You trace the lines of cuneiform and you feel the hand of the scribe. This is not the language of myth. It is the cold, factual tone of an accountant. The list is a single, unbroken continuity. It doesn't say, here ends the age of legend and here begins the age of men. It flows. Alulim rules for 28,800 years. Then Alalngar for 36,000. 8 kings, 5 cities, a total of 241 years. The scribe records this with the same dispassionate precision he uses for a king who ruled for 25 years last century. There is no distinction. And then a single, devastating line cuts through the chronology. Then the flood swept over. It is an event, a hard border in time. After the flood, kingship is lowered from heaven again. The reigns are shorter, but still impossibly long, over 1,000 years. Then, generation by generation, they shrink. 900 years, 400, 126, until they settle into the believable lifespans of mortal men. Why would a civilization record its myths with the sober precision of a census? Unless perhaps they were not recording myth at all. What if they were preserving a memory, a distorted, faded memory, of a history so ancient it operated on a scale we can no longer comprehend? You are in Berlin, in a hall so vast your footsteps echo against the silence. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint, dry scent of ancient stone and dust. Before you rises a wall of impossible blue, the reconstructed Ishtar Gate of Babylon, its glazed bricks gleaming under the gallery lights. Lions and dragons moulded in relief stride across its surface, their muscles tense with a life that has been frozen for 2,500 years. This is the architecture of empire, of absolute power, of a civilization at the zenith of its confidence. It is a statement. But the deepest statement in this room is not this monumental wall. You turn away from its grandeur toward a small, quiet display case. Inside, on a simple pedestal, lies a tablet of hardened mud, no bigger than your palm. It is from a time much older than the gate, from the very dawn of Sumer. This clay is not a king's decree or a priest's prayer. It is a school text. Your eyes, unable to read the cuneiform, can still sense the order in the tiny, precise indentations. Here are multiplication tables, calculations of area, solutions to geometric problems. On other tablets like it, scribes practiced lists of constellations, medical procedures, legal codes, and the names of distant lands. This is the heart of the anomaly. The schoolbooks of Sumer are not the work of a civilization in its infancy. There is no long, slow, clumsy evolution from primitive markings to sophisticated mathematics. The system arrives whole. It appears in the archaeological record already complete, with a complex sexagesimal or base 60 system that we still use to measure our minutes and our circles. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where are the thousands of years of trial and error? The archaeological record is silent. It's as if the teachers arrived on the first day of school with the textbooks already written, the curriculum already set, as if they were not inventing civilization, but restoring it from a set of instructions. Now you find yourself in an altogether different space, not a museum, but a university archive. The air here is alive with the soft rustle of turning pages and the low murmur of academic debate. Sunlight thick with dust motes streams through a high window, illuminating rows of scholarly journals. You pull one from the shelf. It's a study in historical linguistics, and it details a puzzle even more profound than the mathematics. The Sumerian language. It is what is known as a language isolate, a linguistic orphan. It has no known ancestors, no descendants, no cousins. The languages that surrounded it, Akkadian and the other Semitic tongues, are from a completely different family, with a different grammar and vocabulary. Languages, like species, are supposed to evolve. They have family trees. English is a branch on the great Germanic tree. Latin is the parent of the Romance languages, but Sumerian stands alone. Imagine a biologist discovering a species of wolf in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, a wolf with no genetic connection to any other canine on Earth. That is the scale of the anomaly. Where did this language come from? Its grammar is agglutinative, meaning it strings together concepts to form single, long words, a structure more similar to Turkish or Japanese than to any of its ancient neighbours. It appeared in the historical record as a fully formed, complex system of communication, capable of expressing everything from poetry to celestial mechanics, and then it vanished, leaving no children behind. The later civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Akkadians and Babylonians, adopted Sumerian cuneiform for their own languages, but the original tongue became a dead classical language, studied only by priests and scribes, like Latin in the Middle Ages. It is an island in the river of time, a voice that speaks from a past so remote it has no relatives. It is the language of a people without a history, or perhaps a history we have not yet found. You are deep now, far from the public galleries. You follow a curator down a narrow corridor lined with steel shelves that reach from floor to ceiling. The air is cool and dry, filled with the scent of acid-free paper and ancient clay. This is a vault, a kind of suspended animation for the past. He stops before a row of shallow drawers, pulls one open with a soft metallic glide. Inside, nestled in custom foam cutouts, lie dozens of cylinder seals. They are tiny, no bigger than the top joint of your thumb, carved from lapis lazuli, carnelian, obsidian. He carefully lifts one with gloved hands and places it on a velvet cloth. Under the focused light of a desk lamp you see an entire world carved in miniature. Gods with horned helmets, priests making offerings, mythical beasts locked in combat. This was their form of signature, their art, their cosmology, all rolled into one. But then your eyes catch a detail on one seal, a depiction so strange it feels like a glitch in the historical record. You see a familiar arrangement, a large central star surrounded by smaller bodies. It is our solar system, but there are discrepancies. Between Mars and Jupiter, the Sumerians carved another planet. They show Neptune and Uranus, planets invisible to the naked eye, planets we didn't discover until the invention of the telescope in the 18th and 19th centuries. And their depiction places Pluto not as a planet but as a moon of Saturn, a theory some modern astronomers have argued for. How? How did they know? The standard explanation is that these are merely symbolic representations of gods, that the number and placement of the celestial bodies is coincidence. But the precision is unnerving. Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity, as though they were remembering a chart, rather than discovering the stars for the first time? This tiny stone cylinder in a quiet vault doesn't just ask a question, it screams one. To find the answer the Sumerians themselves gave, you must leave the vault and enter the world of their words. You sit in a research library now, the only sound the quiet turning of pages. The book before you is a translation of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, which drew heavily from older Sumerian sources. You read the story. Before humans, before kings, before cities, there were the gods. They call them the Anunnaki. The name is chillingly specific. It translates to those who from heaven to earth came. The texts do not describe them as ethereal spirits or abstract principles. They are physical beings. They wear clothes. They eat food. They pilot skyboats. They wield terrible weapons. They conduct genetic experiments. They have councils and conflicts and betrayals. They are brilliant, powerful, and deeply flawed. According to the tablets, these Anunnaki were the source of all knowledge. They taught humanity agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and writing. They gave humans the blueprints for civilization. This is where the narrative splits. To a historian, this is the language of mythology, a primitive people's attempt to explain the world by creating powerful gods in their own image. But what if we read the text with a different kind of literalism? What if the Sumerians were not inventing gods, but describing beings so technologically advanced that their powers seem divine? The word God might be the only vocabulary a Bronze Age culture had for a scientist, an engineer, a pilot. This controversial reading of the text reframes the entire story. The sudden emergence of Sumerian knowledge is no longer a miracle. It is technology transfer. The impossible astronomical charts are not coincidence. They are inherited data. The King List's pre-Diluvian rulers are not metaphors. They are the Anunnaki themselves, beings with lifespans that dwarf our own. It is a radical, unsettling idea. But it is an answer that fits the facts in a way that coincidence and primitive genius somehow do not. You stand on a windswept tell in southern Iraq, the ruins of the ancient city of Uruk. The sun is white-hot, beating down from a cloudless sky. The air hums softly with heat, and the horizon shimmers, blurring the line between the pale earth and the paler sky. Around you are the broken stumps of mud-brick walls, the ghosts of streets, the faint outline of a ziggurat that once tore a hole in the heavens. This is where it all began. The world's first city, the first writing, the first laws. According to the standard model, this is ground zero for civilization. But as you walk through the dust of Uruk, another thought takes root, nourished by the anomalies we've seen. Was this a beginning, or was it a recovery? Consider the sheer breadth of Sumerian knowledge. They were not just brilliant mathematicians and astronomers. Their medical texts describe surgical procedures, including the removal of cataracts. Their legal codes, like that of King Onamu written centuries before Hammurabi's, established principles of justice, fair trial, and restitution. They had a sophisticated system of agriculture with complex irrigation, a bicameral legislature, and a vibrant literary tradition filled with epic poems and wisdom literature. All of it appearing in a historical blink of an eye. For a society to develop this level of complexity from a baseline of hunter-gatherer tribes should take 10,000 years, a slow, painful crawl of discovery and failure. The Sumerians seem to have done it in 1,000. What if we are looking at the evidence all wrong? What if the suddenness is not a miracle of human ingenuity, but the sign of something else entirely? What if this was not a dawn, but a frantic effort to rekindle a light that had almost been extinguished? A desperate act of preservation. The Sumerians were not inventing. They were remembering. They were rebuilding. The desert sky above Uruk is a black velvet dome, so clear and so dark that the Milky Way spills across it like a river of diamonds. You stand where the ziggurat priests once stood, and you look up. The constellations are sharp, eternal. To understand the depth of Sumerian astronomical knowledge, you must grasp one of the sky's slowest and most profound movements, the precession of the equinoxes. As the Earth spins on its axis, it also wobbles like a dying top. This wobble causes the position of the Sun against the backdrop of the stars on the spring equinox to shift backward, very slowly, through the 12 constellations of the zodiac. It spends roughly 260 years in each constellation, completing a full cycle, a great year, in just under 26,000 years. To discover this cycle requires meticulous, continuous observation over centuries, if not millennia. It requires a stable civilization, accurate star charts, and a sophisticated mathematical framework. The Greeks, with Hipparchus, are credited with its discovery around 127 BC, and yet the Sumerians knew. Their myths and their calendars are structured around the zodiacal ages. Their stories of gods like Dumuzi the shepherd are tied to the age of Taurus the bull. Their god Marduk's rise to prominence coincides with the dawning of the age of Aries the ram. Their entire cosmological clock was based on a celestial mechanic they should have had no way of knowing. To observe even 1 degree of precessional change takes 72 years of perfect record keeping. To identify the pattern would take far longer. How did a civilization, in what we believe to be its infancy, possess knowledge that takes lifetimes to acquire? It is a question that hangs in the cold desert air, a silence as profound as the star-filled darkness. It suggests a continuity of knowledge that stretches back, far back, into the time before the flood, into an age of impossible kings and forgotten science. You're in a planetarium. The lights dim, and the familiar constellations fade into view on the curved ceiling above you. You're surrounded by the quiet whir of projectors and the soft murmur of hushed voices. On a screen, an astronomer brings up a digital reconstruction of a particular Sumerian artifact, a clay disc discovered in the library of King Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. Catalogued as Tablet K8538, it is widely considered to be an ancient astrolabe, a map of the stars. The disc is divided into 8 sectors, filled with complex geometric shapes, lines, and cuneiform characters. For years, it was dismissed as a simple star chart, perhaps a tool for agricultural planning. But in 2008, 2 British researchers, Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel, proposed a different interpretation. They argued that the tablet was a precise, contemporaneous observation of a massive asteroid impact that occurred over the Austrian Alps on June 29th, 3123 BC. Using computer simulations, they mapped the star patterns on the tablet, correcting for precession. The match was uncanny. The tablet, they claimed, was a copy of a Sumerian astronomer's nightly notes, recording the trajectory of an object as it streaked across the sky, culminating in an explosion with the force of over 1,000 tons of TNT. But this raises a staggering problem. The mathematics required to make these kinds of calculations, projecting the path of a celestial object based on observational data, is trigonometry. It is a level of geometry that we did not formally develop until the ancient Greeks, nearly 2,000 years later. How could a Sumerian scribe, a contemporary of the first pharaohs of Egypt, possess this knowledge? The clay is not a schematic, it is data, hard data. It is a pulse of memory frozen in mud, a record of a specific night 5,000 years ago, and it speaks of a scientific sophistication that history tells us should not exist. It is another thread in the tapestry, another piece of evidence suggesting that the Sumerians were working from a forgotten blueprint. The planetarium's projection shifts. You're no longer looking at an impact event, but at a calm, orderly map of our solar system. The planets glide on their orbital paths, elegant and predictable. You see the 5 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, planets known to nearly every ancient culture. But the Sumerian record, as we saw on that tiny cylinder seal, contains more. It contains ghosts, planets that should not have been there. Uranus can, under absolutely perfect conditions of a dark sky, clear atmosphere, and exceptional eyesight, be glimpsed as a faint star. But Neptune is forever lost in the glare of the cosmos, a pale blue dot utterly invisible without a telescope. William Herschel discovered Uranus in 1781. Johann Galle found Neptune in 1846 by following mathematical predictions. Yet the Sumerians seem to have known them. Their texts speak of them. Their cylinder seals depict them. They are associated with specific gods in their pantheon. Anu, the supreme sky father, is linked with Uranus. His brother Enki, god of the waters and of wisdom, is linked with Neptune, a poetic and uncannily accurate association, given Neptune's deep blue colour. This is not just a casual anomaly. It is a profound challenge to the narrative of scientific progress. To chart the orbits of these distant worlds requires two things: advanced optical instruments and a heliocentric model of the solar system, where the sun is at the centre. The Sumerians possessed neither, at least not according to our version of their history. The alternative is that their knowledge of the heavens was not the result of their own observations, but a legacy, a dataset handed down from a source that saw the solar system not from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, but from a perspective of far greater clarity, from a perspective that could see the whole board, not just the nearby pieces. You're now in a modern materials science laboratory. The air is cold and clean, vibrating with the low thrum of machinery. There is no dust here, no echo of ancient voices, only the quiet focus of research. A technician places a sample under the lens of a scanning electron microscope. It is a fragment of Sumerian jewellery, a delicate bead of gold recovered from the royal tombs of Ur. On the monitor, the view zooms in, magnifying the object hundreds, then thousands of times. You expect to see the clumsy, hammered-out marks of early metalworking. Instead, what resolves on the screen is breathtaking. You see evidence of granulation and filigree, techniques that involve soldering tiny grains and wires of gold onto a surface. It is a process that requires precise temperature control, a deep understanding of metallurgy, and tools of incredible fineness. But it gets stranger. Other artifacts, analysed with mass spectrometry, reveal alloys of a startling complexity. Gold bonded with platinum, copper hardened with antimony. These are not simple metals smelted over a charcoal fire. They are recipes, formulas requiring knowledge that we, in our timeline, did not rediscover until the late 19th century. Some Sumerian depictions, especially on cylinder seals, show figures wearing what look for all the world like wristwatches. This has, of course, been dismissed as symbolic ornamentation, but what if it isn't? What if it is a memory, a cargo cult artifact echoing a technology they once saw but could no longer replicate? This is where the evidence becomes deeply uncomfortable. The astronomical knowledge could perhaps be explained by millennia of observation. The mathematics could be the product of a singular genius, but the material science, the knowledge of alloys and fabrication techniques that require a technological infrastructure far beyond anything a Bronze Age society should possess. This doesn't just challenge our timeline, it breaks it. It is a ghost in the machine of history, a signal of knowledge that arrived far too soon. You are in a workshop now, a place not of analysis but of creation. The air smells of hot metal, charcoal and flux. A master goldsmith, a specialist in ancient techniques, is attempting to replicate the Sumerian granulation seen in the tombs of Ur. He leans over a small charcoal furnace, his face illuminated by the orange glow. To make the tiny golden spheres, he melts gold dust on a bed of powdered charcoal. To affix them to a surface without melting the entire piece requires a eutectic solder, a mixture of copper salts and a plant-based glue. When heated, the charcoal pulls oxygen from the copper, creating a microscopic layer of copper-gold alloy that bonds at a temperature lower than the melting point of the gold itself. It is a breathtakingly delicate and counterintuitive process. It took modern jewelers centuries of experimentation to rediscover it. The Egyptians used it, the Etruscans perfected it, and then, for nearly 2,000 years, the secret was lost. And here is the crucial point. The Sumerians were doing it 500 years before the Egyptians. This is not a technology that can be discovered by accident. It is not like finding a new kind of rock or a new plant to eat. It is a multi-stage chemical process that requires abstract thinking, controlled experimentation, and the transmission of complex instructions. Watching the goldsmith work, you realize the immense intellectual leap this represents. It is chemistry, it is materials engineering, and it appears, fully formed at the very beginning. How do you invent chemistry before you have a word for molecules? How do you master metallurgy without 1,000 years of failed experiments? This is the technological equivalent of finding a smartphone in a medieval castle. You can argue that a lone genius might invent calculus, but no single person can invent the entire infrastructure of knowledge required for microsoldering. That knowledge has to come from somewhere. It has to be taught. You're standing now beside an archaeological trench near the site of ancient Eridu, considered by the Sumerians to be the first city on Earth. The sand hides the colour of time. A geologist is examining a freshly extracted core sample, a long cylinder of earth that reads the past like a book. She points to a specific layer in the plastic tube. Your eyes follow her finger. You see strata of silt from ancient riverbeds, dark lines of organic matter from long-dead marsh grasses, and then a thick uniform band of sterile clay. It is about 3 meters thick. Beneath it, the signs of human habitation. Pottery shards, ash from cooking fires, resume. Above it, the same, but this layer in the middle is empty. It is a scar, the calling card of a massive, devastating flood. This is not a myth, it is geology. In 1920, the archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley found this same layer at Ur. He found it at Kish. He found it at Shuruppak. A single, cataclysmic flood event that scoured the landscape of southern Mesopotamia sometime around 2900 BC. The water was so powerful it laid down a blanket of sediment up to 3.5 meters deep, burying everything. This geological fact aligns perfectly with the dividing line in the Sumerian King List. Then the flood swept over. The stories of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, building a great boat to survive the deluge, are not just allegories. They are memories of a real event, an event that wiped the slate clean. This changes everything. It means the civilization that came after the flood, the one we call Sumer, was not a beginning. It was a restart. A group of survivors, clinging to the fragments of a world that had been washed away, trying to rebuild from a body of knowledge that was now nothing more than a ghost, a story, a collection of tablets carried onto an ark. You are in a radiocarbon dating lab now, surrounded by the hum and click of accelerator mass spectrometers. The silence here is heavy, the kind that surrounds precise, delicate work. A lab technician in a white coat explains the process. They take organic material, a piece of charcoal from a hearth, a seed from a clay pot, from just below the flood layer and just above it. They vaporize it, accelerate the carbon atoms to near the speed of light, and count the isotopes. It is the gold standard for dating the past, a clock that measures the slow, steady decay of life itself. The results come back, consistent across multiple sites. The civilization before the flood layer dates back to at least 3500 BC, the civilization after. It begins again almost immediately around 2800 BC. There is no gap, no slow rebuilding over centuries, no return to a primitive state. The survivors, it seems, got right back to work. But this raises a terrifying question. If the post-flood Sumerians were this advanced, what was the civilization before the flood like? The one that had 240 years of unbroken kingship, according to their own records. The one that taught the survivors everything they knew. This is the central, haunting implication of the flood layer. Our entire understanding of Sumer is based on the echoes of a post-apocalyptic society. We are studying the equivalent of a culture rebuilding after a global nuclear war, using salvaged knowledge and fragmented blueprints. The sophistication we see in Sumer is not the peak of a civilization's climb. It is the desperate, heroic effort of a handful of survivors to preserve the memory of a world that was already ancient when their own story began. The sand of Iraq doesn't just hide cities, it hides the shadow of a far greater civilization, one whose true nature we may have only just begun to glimpse. You are back in the planetarium. The astronomer at the console is no longer showing you the present-day sky, but using software to wind back the celestial clock. The stars begin to shift, their movements accelerated by thousands of years per second. This is the power of precession, made visible. The constellations drift. Polaris moves away from the celestial pole. New stars take its place. He stops the simulation at 2500 BC, the age of Leo. He projects the star map of that epoch onto the dome. You see the Lion constellation rising on the spring equinox. You see the pyramids of Giza on the ground below, aligned perfectly with the belt stars of Orion as they reach their lowest point in the precessional cycle. Now he shifts focus to Mesopotamia. The Sumerians link the age of Leo with a great cataclysm, the Flood. Their epic poems describe a world-drowning event that coincided with a specific celestial alignment involving the constellation of the Lion. Modern geology has its own story of this period. 10 to 500 BC is near the end of the Younger Dryas, a geological period of extreme climate instability. Melting ice sheets from the last ice age caused catastrophic sea level rise and megafloods across the globe. Is this the source of the great flood myths found in hundreds of cultures worldwide? If the Sumerians inherited knowledge of precession, it means they inherited knowledge from a civilization that was sophisticated enough to observe the skies during the last ice age. A civilization whose existence is not accounted for in our history books. The astronomical knowledge encoded in their myths is not just a curiosity. It is a timestamp. It is a message from a drowned world, carried forward by survivors, a memory of a sky that no human has seen for 12,000 years. The knowledge was ancient when Sumer began. This is where the story truly breaks free of its conventional moorings and drifts into a deeper, more unsettling ocean of time. Let's leave the planetarium and step into a place of pure theory. An office, late at night. Books on astrophysics and ancient history are piled high on the desk. Outside the window, the city lights create a hazy glow that obscures the stars. Here, with a calculator and a pen, we confront the raw impossibility of the precession problem. To discover the great year of 25,920 years, a civilization needs to exist long enough and remain stable enough to keep meticulous records. Let's be generous. Let's say a culture of brilliant naked-eye observers could detect the 1-degree shift of precession every 72 years. To confirm the pattern and calculate the full cycle would require, at a bare minimum, observations spanning several zodiacal ages. At 2,060 years per age, we are talking about a continuous scientific project lasting 5,000 to 6,000 years. The entire recorded history of our species, from the first Sumerian cities to the mission on Mars, is only about 5,000 years long. There is no room in our established timeline for a civilization that old. We have evidence of hunter-gatherers, of early agricultural settlements, but nothing that suggests a global scientific culture capable of this kind of long-term project. Orthodox history simply has no candidate. This is not a small discrepancy. It is a gaping hole in the story of humanity. A 6,000-year scientific endeavor that ended before our own history began. Who were these people? Where are their cities, their tools, their graves? The silence from the archaeological record is deafening, unless the evidence is not silent, unless it is simply not being recognized for what it is, unless the megalithic structures of the ancient world, the stone circles, the aligned temples, are the fossilized remains of this very project, a global network of observatories built by a civilization we have not yet dared to name. You're back at the ruins of Eridu, the first city, but this time you're not looking at the visible remains. You're in a tent hunched over a laptop with a team of geophysical surveyors. The air is thick with the smell of dust and hot electronics. On the screen, a ghostly image is slowly resolving. It is the result of a ground-penetrating radar survey, a technology that sends radio waves into the earth and maps the structures hidden beneath the sand. As the image becomes clearer, your breath catches. Beneath the oldest foundations of the known city, there is something else. The radar shows the clear geometric outlines of much larger, more complex structures. Walls, courtyards, a vast planned complex that predates the city of Eridu itself. This is the archaeological frontier. The evidence for the pre-Diluvian world is not in the history books, because we have only just invented the tools to see it. What the radar shows is a city beneath a city, not just a few primitive huts, but a settlement of significant size and sophistication. And here is where it connects. The Sumerian King List states that before the flood, the city of Eridu was the seat of the first two kings, Alulim and Alalngar, who together ruled for 64,800 years. For centuries that was myth, a fantastic story, but the radar doesn't see myths, it sees foundations, it sees architecture, and it is telling us in the cold language of data that the Sumerians were right. There was something here before, something that was buried, not just by sand, but by a cataclysm so profound it nearly erased its memory from the world. We're no longer digging for the beginning of civilization. We're searching for the ruins of a lost chapter of humanity, a chapter that may hold the key to who we are and who taught us to be civilized in the first place. The geophysical survey tent at Eridu feels like an infirmary for a dying theory. The patient is the standard model of history, and its vital signs are failing. You stare at the radar plot on the screen, at the ghost city sleeping beneath the sand. This buried layer presents a stark physical challenge to the narrative of slow linear progress. Archaeology works by excavation. It is slow, painstaking, and expensive. Only a tiny fraction of a site like Eridu has ever been properly dug. It's possible, even probable, that the answers to all our questions are right here, meters below your feet, waiting for a shovel or a drill. But what happens when we combine this new data with the old? When we overlay the radar map with the King List? The story that emerges is radical. The texts say kingship was established at Eridu. The radar shows a city that existed before the city we knew. The texts say a great flood wiped the slate clean. The geological core samples show the physical evidence of that flood. The texts say civilization was lowered from heaven a second time. The archaeological record shows a sudden, fully formed culture re-emerging from the mud with inexplicable knowledge. Each piece of evidence on its own can be explained away. The King List is myth. The astronomical knowledge is coincidence. The metallurgy is the work of a few isolated geniuses. But when you put them all together, the coincidences start to look like a conspiracy of evidence. The fragments of clay, the whispers from the ground, the light from distant stars, they all begin to tell the same story. A story of loss and of a desperate, magnificent attempt to remember. A story that suggests we are a species with amnesia, and the Sumerians were the first to try and write down the dream they could barely recall. You are thousands of miles away now and thousands of meters higher. The air is thin and cold, and the sun has a fierce, unfiltered intensity. You stand on the shore of Lake Titicaca, a vast sapphire sea cradled high in the Bolivian Andes. The water stretches to a horizon serrated by snow-capped peaks. According to local Aymara tradition, this is the place where the creator god Viracocha appeared after a great flood and began to fashion a new race of humanity from stone. He was described as a tall, pale-skinned, bearded figure who came to teach the arts of civilization. He was a culture bearer, a teacher. The similarities to the Sumerian stories of Enki are unmistakable. You look across the water at the monumental ruins of Pumapunku and Tiahuanaco. Here, massive blocks of andesite and diorite, some weighing over 100 tons, are cut with a precision that defies modern explanation. The cuts are perfectly straight, the angles impossibly sharp, the drill holes machined with a regularity that suggests power tools. The orthodox dating for these sites is around 500 AD, but some geologists, examining the sediment layers in the lake bed, have argued that Tiahuanaco was a port city when the lake was 30 meters higher, a condition that hasn't existed for at least 12,000 years. This is the same Ice Age cataclysmic time frame hinted at by the Sumerian astronomical data. Here, on the other side of the world, a continent away from Mesopotamia, you find the same story. A great flood. A bearded teacher god who brings the seeds of civilization to the survivors, and megalithic ruins of impossible precision that whisper of a lost technology. It is as if the same event left its traumatic memory seared into the consciousness of cultures that should have had no contact with each other. It is an echo in a cave, a story that reverberates across oceans and millennia. You sit in a quiet university library surrounded by the smell of old paper and leather bindings. You're in the ethnography section, a catalogue of humanity's stories. You pull down volumes from every corner of the globe. The Greek story of Deucalion, the Hindu tale of Manu, the Hopi emergence myth, the Australian Aboriginal stories of the Dreamtime. From hundreds of cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, the same story emerges, told in 1,000 different tongues. There was a former age, an advanced golden age, a global cataclysm, usually a flood but sometimes a fire or an ice age, destroyed that world. A handful of people survived, often warned by a benevolent god or spirit, and after the cataclysm, the survivors were visited by a teacher, a civilizing hero, who taught them the rudiments of the new world, how to plant crops, how to build shelters, how to read the stars. The mainstream anthropological view is that these are archetypes, products of a universal human psychology, that a flood is a natural metaphor for destruction and rebirth. But this explanation feels thin, dismissive. It ignores the specificity of the details that repeat across cultures, the 7 sages who survive, the warning from a god, the saving of knowledge on tablets or in an ark, the connection of the cataclysm to a celestial event. Could these stories be what they claim to be, not myths but memories, a preserved, shared trauma, passed down through countless generations, distorted by time and translation, but still retaining the core elements of a true event? If so, then the Sumerian story is not unique. It is simply the oldest written version we have found so far. It is the first time a survivor of the Great Forgetting managed to write down what everyone else was struggling to remember. The flood was not a local event, it was the end of a world, and Sumer was its first echo. You are now in the humid green of the Mexican jungle. The air is thick and alive, buzzing with insects and the calls of unseen birds. Sweat traces paths down your temples. You stand at the foot of the Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, a stone pyramid that functions as a massive, intricate calendar. The Mayans, like the Sumerians, possessed a startlingly advanced understanding of astronomy and mathematics. They calculated the length of the solar year to an accuracy of 99.99%. They tracked the synodic period of Venus with an error of only a few hours over 500 years, and at the heart of their cosmology was a familiar figure, a bearded, pale-skinned god who came from across the sea. They called him Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl. He brought them writing, mathematics, and the calendar. He forbade human sacrifice and taught a message of peace. Then he departed, promising one day to return. You look at the carvings that adorn the temples. You see feathered serpents, a symbol of this teacher god. The serpent is a curious symbol, found worldwide in connection with ancient wisdom. In Sumer, the god Enki was often depicted as a serpent, and was credited with creating modern humans. In the Bible, a serpent in the Garden of Eden offers Adam and Eve the fruit of the tree of knowledge. In ancient India, the Naga were a race of serpent beings who were custodians of profound wisdom. Is this another coincidence? Or is the serpent a symbolic marker, a calling card left by a single, globe-spanning group of teachers in the deep past? Could the Anunnaki of Sumer, Viracocha of the Andes, and Quetzalcoatl of Mesoamerica all be different names for the same visitors? The thought is dizzying, a heresy against the established model of isolated cultural development. But the patterns carved in stone and preserved in myth are there. They are waiting for us to connect the dots. You leave the jungle heat of Mexico for the monsoonal humidity of Cambodia. You stand before the Bayan Temple at Angkor Thom, its stone towers carved with hundreds of serene, smiling faces. This vast temple complex, swallowed by the jungle for centuries, is a masterpiece of sacred geometry and astronomical alignment. And here, too, you find the serpent. Massive stone balustrades in the form of 7-headed Nagas line the causeways leading to the temples. In the lore of this region, the Naga were a race of intelligent, semi-divine, serpentine beings who lived in a subterranean kingdom. They were the guardians of ancient wisdom and were said to have intermarried with the first Khmer kings, their blood flowing in the royal lineage. This pattern, this global motif of serpentine teachers, is too specific to be a simple archetype. The serpent is not just a symbol of evil or temptation, as it has become in some Western traditions. In these ancient cultures, it is a symbol of knowledge, of healing, of cosmic forces, and of the teachers who brought that knowledge to humanity. The caduceus, the modern symbol of medicine, is 2 serpents entwined around a staff, the symbol of the Sumerian healing god Ningishzida, the feathered serpent of the Maya and Aztec, the Naga kings of Southeast Asia, the serpent god Enki of Sumer. What are we to make of this? Is it possible that we are seeing the faint mythologized footprint of a single coherent group, a group that used the serpent as its emblem, and who, in the aftermath of a global cataclysm, travelled the world to restart the civilizational project? It is an extraordinary claim, one that lies far outside the bounds of conventional history. But it is a theory that elegantly connects a vast and disparate body of evidence that, until now, has been treated as a collection of beautiful but unrelated fairy tales. You are back on the Bolivian Altiplano, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. The wind is relentless, a thin, cold razor against your skin. The sky is an intense, bruised blue. You stand amidst the ruins of Pumapunku, a site that looks less like a temple and more like a cosmic catastrophe. Giant slabs of red sandstone and diorite lie scattered like a child's abandoned toys. But these are not toys. The largest block weighs an estimated 131 metric tons. To move it here from its quarry would have required technology and logistics that beggar belief. But the weight is not the greatest mystery. The mystery is in the workmanship. You kneel beside a fallen H-block, one of the site's signature features. You run your gloved hand over its surface. It is smooth as polished granite, with sharp 90-degree interior angles. You see a groove running along its length, just 2 millimeters wide, with a series of perfectly uniform drill holes inside it. No bronze or stone tool could create this. Diorite is one of the hardest stones on Earth, nearly an 8 on the Mohs scale. To cut it with this level of precision today would require diamond-tipped power tools and laser-guided machinery. The local people, the Aymara, say that Pumapunku was built not by their ancestors, but by the gods, in a single night, using a technology that could make the stones soft and carry them through the air with sound. This is the physical evidence that underpins the myths. The Sumerians wrote about their teachers. At Pumapunku you can touch their work. The stone doesn't just remember, it bears witness. It is a silent, immovable testament to a level of technological capability that has no business existing in the ancient world. It is the hardware to the Sumerian software, a physical anomaly that echoes their intellectual one. You pull out a set of architectural plans. On one side, a layout of a Sumerian temple from Kafaja in modern Iraq. On the other, a plan of the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, Mexico. You place them side by side. The similarities are striking. Both are built on raised platforms. Both feature a central shrine with smaller subsidiary rooms arranged symmetrically around it. Both are oriented to the cardinal directions. You do the same with a drawing of a ziggurat from Ur and a stepped pyramid from Saqqara in Egypt. The architectural grammar is the same. Now you look closer at the construction details. At Pumapunku you see complex interlocking joints, where stones are fitted together with a precision that makes the structure earthquake-proof. You see the same technique in the megalithic walls of Cuzco and Ollantaytambo in Peru. You see it again, halfway across the world, in the Osirion at Abydos, Egypt, and in some of the oldest polygonal masonry in Greece. How is this possible? The standard model of independent invention requires us to believe that cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all by sheer coincidence, arrived at the same highly specific and complex architectural solutions. It's like finding that cultures who never met all independently invented the sonnet, with the same rhyme scheme and meter. A more logical, if more challenging explanation is that they were all working from a common blueprint, that the builders of these enigmatic sites were all heirs to a single, ancient tradition of stonework, a tradition that was global in its reach. This does not mean that the Sumerians sailed to Peru. It suggests that both the Sumerians and the pre-Incan cultures of the Andes were the descendants of an even older parent civilization, one that had mastered these techniques long before the flood, and whose scattered survivors carried the knowledge with them to the far corners of the New World. You travel north now, into southeastern Turkey. The landscape is arid, rolling hills under a vast, empty sky. You stand on a rounded hilltop, a potbelly hill, which gives the site its name, Göbekli Tepe. For decades, this was thought to be nothing more than a medieval cemetery. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began to dig. What he found shattered the timeline of human history. You stand now within one of the excavated stone enclosures. Massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, are arranged in circles. They are carved with exquisite stylized reliefs of animals, foxes, boars, cranes, and snakes. This is the world's oldest known temple. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at 9600 BC. That is 7,000 years before the Sumerians, 6,000 years before Stonehenge. It was built by people who were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, with no pottery, no writing, no metal tools. You run your hand over the cool, rough limestone of a pillar. You trace the outline of a vulture, its wings outstretched. On this pillar, known as Pillar 43, researchers have identified a complex series of astronomical symbols. The vulture, they argue, represents the constellation Sagittarius. The scorpion carving corresponds to Scorpius. The animal figures are not just decoration, they are a star map, and they record a specific date, a cataclysmic comet impact, the same event that geologists believe triggered the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, around 10,150 BC. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, it seems, were not just hunter-gatherers. They were sophisticated astronomers, heirs to a scientific tradition that was already ancient 12,000 years ago. They built this temple not just as a place of worship, but as a memorial, a message carved in stone to warn future generations of a cosmic truth they had learned at a terrible price, that the sky can fall, and the civilization that taught the Sumerians, perhaps it was not destroyed by a flood after all, perhaps it was destroyed by fire from heaven. The wind whips dust across the hilltop at Göbekli Tepe. It is a lonely, exposed place. You feel a profound sense of temporal vertigo standing here. This site redefines the word ancient, but perhaps its greatest mystery is not its age, but its end. Around 8000 BC, after nearly 2,000 years of use, the entire complex was deliberately and carefully buried. Millions of tons of earth, stone, and animal bones were brought in to entomb the temples. It was an undertaking on the scale of the original construction. Why? Why would a people go to such lengths to bury their most sacred site? An archaeologist on site offers the conventional theory. It was a ritual act, a way of putting the temple to rest as their society transitioned to agriculture and moved on. But there is another, more haunting possibility. What if Göbekli Tepe was not put to rest, but put to sleep? What if it was buried for preservation? The builders knew that any structure left to the mercy of the elements would eventually crumble to dust. But a buried structure could survive for millennia. It could become a time capsule. Perhaps the message carved on Pillar 43 was not just a memorial, but a warning. A warning that the cosmos is not a benign clockwork mechanism, but a place of violent, unpredictable events. Perhaps the builders, the last inheritors of a scientific tradition from a lost world, understood this. Perhaps they buried their temple as an act of hope, a hope that a future civilization would one day be advanced enough to find it, to understand its message, and to relearn the forgotten science of the stars. It connects back to Sumer. It is the same pattern. Not just a restart, but a conscious, deliberate effort to pass knowledge across the abyss of a cataclysm. A message in a bottle, thrown into the ocean of time, waiting 12,000 years to be found. The journey takes you now to the American Southwest. You're in a kiva, a circular subterranean prayer chamber, sitting on a cool stone bench. The air smells of dry earth and juniper smoke. An elder of the Hopi nation sits across from you, his face a roadmap of deep time. He speaks, not of myths, but of history as it has been passed down to him. He tells of the previous worlds, and the destructions by fire and ice that ended them. He tells of how the Hopi ancestors emerged into this, the fourth world, through a sipapu, an opening in the earth. He speaks of the Kachinas, the powerful and benevolent spirit beings who taught the first people how to live in balance with the land, how to plant corn, and how to read the sacred patterns of the sky. His voice is quiet, measured. This is not folklore to him. It is memory, preserved through generations of careful oral transmission. You ask him about the ant people, who sheltered the Hopi ancestors underground during one of the destructions. You see depictions of them on ancient rock art panels, slim-bodied figures with large heads and huge eyes. They look unnervingly like the popular image of extraterrestrials. The elder simply smiles. The stories, he says, are what they are. This is what haunts you. Western academia is built on the written word. It dismisses oral tradition as unreliable, as prone to distortion. But what if it is not? What if these cultures, these knowledge keepers of Turtle Island, have preserved a chronicle of events that stretches back far beyond our own written records? What if their histories of world-ending cataclysms and sky god teachers are not metaphors but eyewitness accounts? It would mean that the Sumerians were not the only ones to remember. It would mean the memory of the lost world is everywhere, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to learn how to listen. You leave the quiet kiva and return to the library of clay. You're holding two narratives in your mind, two histories from opposite ends of the earth, one written in cuneiform, the other spoken in the Hopi language. Both tell of ancestors who came from a drowned world. Both speak of powerful beings who taught the survivors the arts of civilization, the Hopi Kachinas, the Sumerian Anunnaki. Both traditions record a deep knowledge of astronomy and celestial cycles. The Hopi calendar, like the Mayan, is one of extraordinary complexity and accuracy. Their cosmology is mapped onto the landscape, with villages and shrines built to reflect the positions of the stars. The parallels are too numerous, too specific to ignore. What is happening here? The academic world is built on specialization. The archaeologist who studies Sumer does not talk to the ethnographer who studies the Hopi. The geologist who drills ice cores in Greenland does not compare notes with the linguist who studies Proto-Indo-European. They live in different intellectual worlds. But what happens when you step back and look at the big picture? You see the same patterns repeating, the same stories echoing, the same fingerprints on megalithic structures all over the planet. The evidence is not pointing to dozens of isolated miraculous births of civilization. It is pointing to a single global event, a lost civilization, a cataclysm that destroyed it, and a concerted worldwide effort by the survivors to preserve its legacy. The Sumerians were not the beginning. They were simply the most successful of the restoration projects. The first to rediscover writing, and thus the first to write down the memory that all of humanity shared. They are the headwaters of our known history, but the river began much, much further upstream, in a landscape we are only now beginning to map. You are back in the cool, silent halls of the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin. You walk past the monumental Ishtar Gate, past the displays of intricate jewellery and pottery, to a small, unassuming clay cylinder covered in cuneiform. It is an inscription of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon who ruled in the 6th century BC. He was an antiquarian, a king obsessed with the deep past. The inscription describes his excavation of the foundations of a temple at Sippar. He digs deep, past the levels of his recent predecessors, past the legendary Sargon of Akkad, past even the earliest Sumerian kings. And there, deep in the earth, he finds the original foundation stone, laid by Naram-Sin, who ruled 1700 years before him. But then he writes something extraordinary. He says that this foundation stone was itself a restoration, built upon an even older temple, one that had been built so long ago that its origins were lost to memory. Then you find another inscription, this one from an early Sumerian king, which reads, "I found the temple in a state of decay. I restored it. I cleared its foundations and rebuilt it according to the original plans." Again and again this theme appears in the ancient texts. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they did not see themselves as inventors, but as custodians, restorers. They speak of rebuilding what was before, of consulting the drawings from the time before the flood. This is the narrative framework that makes sense of all the anomalies, the advanced knowledge, the impossible timeline, the global myths, the out-of-place technology. They are all echoes, fragments, salvaged pieces of a world that was lost. The Sumerians are not the dawn of civilization. They are the children of a great forgetting, the first generation to wake from a long, dark night, struggling to piece together the fragments of a dream. They are the beginning of our history, but not the beginning of the human story. They are simply the first chapter of the restoration. You are walking through the hushed halls of a natural history museum. The air is still and carries the faint, sweet smell of preservative chemicals. You stand before the skeleton of a mammoth, its great curved tusks sweeping towards the ceiling. This creature and the world it inhabited vanished from the earth around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. This is the moment in deep time that all the threads of our story seem to lead back to. The Younger Dryas, the astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe, the flood myths from every corner of the planet, the geological evidence of catastrophic sea level rise. Something happened, something terrible, an event or a series of events that plunged the world into chaos and nearly drove our species to extinction. The civilization we have been searching for, the one that taught the Sumerians, was a casualty of this event. It was a maritime civilization, whose cities were located on the coastlines of the world, coastlines that are now 100 meters underwater. Its knowledge of astronomy, of mathematics, of engineering, was not lost in a single moment, but drowned over a period of centuries. The survivors were scattered, traumatized. They became refugees on a hostile planet. Some, like the builders of Göbekli Tepe, tried to preserve the high science. Others, like the ancestors of the Sumerians and the Egyptians, carried with them the practical knowledge of statecraft, of law, of agriculture. And many more were reduced to a state of primitive survival, their only inheritance a collection of stories about a golden age before the flood. This is the new map of the ancient past that the evidence suggests, a map with a great drowned continent of lost time at its centre. We are the descendants, not of hunter-gatherers who miraculously discovered civilization, but of the traumatized survivors of a civilization that was lost. You're in a deep sea submersible, thousands of feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. The water outside is a perfect crushing black. The only light comes from the powerful lamps of your vehicle, illuminating a blizzard of marine snow. You're descending along the mid-Atlantic ridge. A geologist on the comm system explains what you're seeing on the sonar. About 12,800 years ago, at the start of the Younger Dryas, something slammed into the North American ice sheet. The evidence for this impact is overwhelming. A thin layer of molten glass, nanodiamonds, and extraterrestrial iridium found in sediment cores across 4 continents. The impactor, likely a fragmented comet, flash vaporized millions of tons of ice, triggering unimaginable floods and plunging the Northern Hemisphere into a 1,000-year winter. This is the kill shot. This is the event memorialized at Göbekli Tepe. The resulting sea level rise, a sudden surge that would have drowned coastal cities around the world, is the likely origin of the global flood myths. It was not a single biblical flood of 40 days and 40 nights. It was a centuries-long process of inundation, a slow, relentless swallowing of the land. The world of the Ice Age did not end gracefully. It ended in fire and water. The advanced civilization that tracked the stars and built megalithic wonders was not wiped out by a gradual climate shift they could adapt to. It was destroyed by a sudden, violent and cosmic event. The world of Ziusudra, of Manu, of the ancestors of the Hopi, was torn apart. The survivors were not just rebuilding a civilization, they were doing it in a world that had been fundamentally broken, and this is perhaps the greatest testament to their legacy. Not that their world was lost, but that any of its knowledge managed to survive at all. You are back in the library, the quiet heart of our investigation. You pull down the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest surviving works of literature. In it, the hero King Gilgamesh, terrified of his own mortality, seeks out Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, the Sumerian Ziusudra. When Gilgamesh finds him, Utnapishtim's story is not one of divine deliverance. It is a story of trauma. He speaks of the terror of the storm, the cries of his people as they drowned, the horror of seeing the world turned back into a featureless ocean. He speaks of the gods themselves cowering in fear from the deluge they had unleashed. When you read this ancient text through the lens of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, it transforms. This is not myth. It is a survivor's account. The terror is real. The descriptions of a world-ending catastrophe are not poetic exaggeration. They are journalism. The Anunnaki are no longer distant, all-powerful gods. They are the leaders of a technologically advanced civilization, faced with a cosmic disaster they cannot control. Some, like the god Enlil, argue for letting humanity perish. Others, like Enki, work in secret to save a handful of them. This is not a story about gods and men. It is a story about a hard choice in the face of annihilation. Who do you save? What knowledge is essential? How do you ensure that the spark of civilization is not extinguished forever? The Anunnaki of the texts begin to look less like gods and more like the administrators of a lifeboat, making impossible choices in the final hours of a dying world. The fragments of clay no longer whisper of myth. They scream with the urgency of a preserved memory, a final report from a world on the brink of oblivion. You're in a cartography room, surrounded by maps of every conceivable kind. Satellite images of ocean floors, geological surveys, ancient Portolan charts. You unroll a map of the world as it was during the last ice age, 13,000 years ago. The coastlines are utterly alien. With sea levels 120 meters lower, vast areas that are now seabed were dry land. The Persian Gulf did not exist. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed out into a fertile plain that stretched all the way to the Strait of Hormuz. The islands of Indonesia were part of a massive continent called Sunderland. A land bridge connected Siberia and Alaska. This is the lost world. This is the map of the civilization we have been searching for. A global, maritime culture, whose great cities and ports are now lost beneath the waves. The story we have been taught, of civilization beginning with the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, is not wrong. It is just incomplete. It is like starting a biography in the subject's middle age. The Sumerians did not invent civilization in a vacuum. They inherited it. They were the beneficiaries of a rescue mission, a concerted effort by the survivors of the Younger Dryas cataclysm to replant the seeds of knowledge in the most fertile ground they could find. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was one of those places. The Nile Valley in Egypt was another, the Indus Valley a third. The story of human civilization is not a single steady ascent. It is a story of a catastrophic fall and a long, slow, painful climb back up. We are not the first. We are the children of the survivors, and our history is haunted by the ghost of the world they lost, a world whose true grandeur we are only now beginning to comprehend. The clay doesn't lie. It simply waited for us to learn how to ask the right questions. You are back in the office, the desk littered with maps and books and translations of ancient texts. The city outside is quiet now, the traffic a distant whisper. You look at the evidence laid out before you, a vast and fragmented puzzle. The comfortable story of humanity's slow, steady march from cave to city lies in ruins. In its place is a far stranger, more dramatic and more humbling narrative, a story of cycles, of great peaks of civilizational achievement, followed by catastrophic collapses and long periods of forgetting. The Sumerians were not the first peak. They were the beginning of the recovery from the last great valley. This new model of history does not answer every question. In fact, it raises even more profound ones. Who were the people of this lost civilization? Were they a branch of Homo sapiens like us, or something else? If their teachers, the Anunnaki, were not gods but advanced beings, were they survivors of that same lost civilization? Or were they visitors from somewhere else entirely? These are questions that, for now, we cannot answer. The evidence is too fragmented, the silence from the deep past too profound. But the questions themselves are important. They force us to reconsider our place in the cosmos, to question the arrogance of our belief that we are the pinnacle of creation. They ask us to be humble in the face of the vastness of time. The story of Sumer is a reminder that what we call history is just the latest chapter, and that the book of humanity is far longer and far stranger than we have ever been taught. We are a civilization with amnesia, trying to understand ourselves by reading only the last few pages of our own autobiography. The rest is lost in the dark. You are back in the dusty archive of the British Museum, in a room filled with the quiet rustle of paper. A historian unrolls a large colour-coded chart. It is a cross-cultural comparison of flood myths. On it, you see the story of Ziusudra from Sumer, Noah from the Hebrew Bible, Deucalion from Greece, Manu from India. In each story, a hero is warned of an impending flood, builds a boat, and saves a remnant of humanity. But now you notice a deeper, more specific parallel. The Sumerian texts speak of the Apkallu, 7 semi-divine sages who lived before the flood and gave humanity the foundations of culture. After the flood, they are said to have reappeared to help the survivors rebuild. In India, the Vedas tell of the Saptarishi, the 7 sages, who survive the cosmic flood in a boat with Manu and bring sacred knowledge into the new age. In ancient Egypt, the pyramid texts refer to the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, a group of wise beings who ruled in a golden age before the first pharaohs. This is a recurring motif, a specific number, 7, a group of wise beings who act as the repositories and transmitters of civilization's essential knowledge across the boundary of a cataclysm. Is this another coincidence? Or are these traditions all preserving the memory of the same group? Perhaps the civilizer gods, the Anunnaki, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl, were not a pantheon of deities but the leaders of this rescue operation. And the 7 sages were their specialists, the scientists, engineers and architects tasked with preserving the core data of their civilization. This framework does not require us to believe in gods or aliens. It asks us to consider a far more terrestrial and perhaps more plausible scenario, that an advanced human civilization, faced with extinction, took deliberate and extraordinary measures to ensure its knowledge would survive. The Sumerian texts, in this light, become the most detailed record we have of that survival plan. They are the field notes from the dawn of the restoration. You're in the cartography room again, the map of the Ice Age world spread out before you. The pieces of the puzzle are all here now, scattered across its unfamiliar continents. You begin to place them. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, emerge from the drowned coast of the Persian Gulf, carrying their precious tablets of knowledge. Ziusudra, their chosen pupil, becomes the first post-Diluvian king. They establish Eridu as their first headquarters, rebuilding what was there before. From this beachhead of restored civilization, a mission is launched. Enki, the leader of the scientific faction, goes west to the Nile Valley, where he becomes known to the Egyptians as Ptah, the god of craftsmen and architects. His counterpart, Enlil, head of the administrative faction, remains in Mesopotamia to oversee the development of Sumer. Other members of this cadre, these Anunnaki, travel further. One goes to the Andes, where he is remembered as the bearded god Viracocha. Another to Mesoamerica, where he becomes Quetzalcoatl. This is, of course, a speculative reconstruction, a heresy. But it is a narrative that honours the evidence in a way the standard model does not. It explains the suddenness of Sumer. It explains the impossible knowledge of precession. It explains the flood myths, the teacher gods, the shared architectural motifs, the out-of-place technologies. It frames the Anunnaki not as aliens, but as the human survivors of a human cataclysm. Terribly advanced, godlike in their powers compared to the traumatized hunter-gatherers they encountered, but human nonetheless. The story is no longer about gods descending from heaven. It is about a desperate global mission undertaken by the last scientists of a drowned world. A mission to restart the human story, to ensure that the great forgetting was not absolute. A mission whose first and most successful chapter was written in the mud of ancient Sumer. Our journey ends where it began. You are back in Iraq, standing once more before the ruins of Uruk. The sun is setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The crumbling ziggurat is a black silhouette against the dying light. The heat of the day is finally bleeding out of the earth, and a cool breeze whispers through the broken walls. This place, which once seemed like the beginning of everything, now feels like something else, an end, an echo, a monument to a memory. You look at the cuneiform tablets in your mind's eye, at the impossible numbers of the King List, at the star charts from a sky 12,000 years gone. You see the flood layers, the out-of-place technologies, the myths that are not myths. You see the ghost of a civilization so old its ruins lie beneath the sea, and its memory survives only in the stories of its scattered, traumatized children. The Sumerians were the first to write it all down. They were the ones who took the fading oral traditions of the post-cataclysmic world and fixed them in clay, creating a library of the forgotten. Our history books call them the cradle of civilization, but the evidence suggests they were the cradle of our amnesia. They were the generation that could still remember the dream, but could no longer recall the waking world that preceded it. They knew they were restoring something, but they had forgotten what, precisely, had been lost. Their stories are a message to us. They are a call to remember, a call to look deeper into our own past, to question the comfortable stories we tell ourselves, and to accept the humbling, terrifying, and ultimately magnificent possibility that we are not the first great technological civilization this planet has produced. We are simply the latest, and perhaps the most forgetful. You are alone now, sitting on the highest tier of the crumbling ziggurat at Uruk. The sky is full of stars, the same stars the Sumerian priests watched from this very spot 5,000 nights ago. The wind is a low moan across the desert. All the evidence, all the threads of this vast and tangled story settle around you in the cool darkness. We are left with a choice. We can accept the standard model, with its miracles of sudden genius and its vast collection of inexplicable coincidences. We can believe that dozens of unconnected cultures all happen to invent the same flood myths, worship the same serpent gods, and build the same kinds of astronomically aligned temples, all by chance. Or we can accept the story the ancients themselves told us, a story of a former world, a great cataclysm, and a heroic effort to preserve the flame of knowledge for a future they could only hope would one day exist. This second path is harder. It requires us to abandon the comforting idea of linear progress. It forces us to confront the possibility that we are not the smartest our species has ever been. It opens the door to a human story far deeper, more dramatic, and more mysterious than we have ever imagined. It suggests that our civilization is not a fortress on a hill, but a fragile sandcastle on a shore, and that the tide has gone out before. But it is a story that fits the evidence. It honours the testimony of the ancients. It connects the dots between the flood layers in Iraq, the star maps at Göbekli Tepe, the machined precision of Pumapunku, and the sudden, blazing dawn of civilization in Sumer. The questions that remain are immense. They are the work of generations to come. But perhaps the most important first step is simply to admit that there is a mystery to be solved, to accept that the clay tablets, the standing stones, and the oral traditions of the world are not just the quaint artifacts of a primitive past, but a library of survivor testimonies from a chapter of our own story that we have forgotten how to read. You are in your own room, the journey is over. The sounds of museums, laboratories, and windswept ruins have faded, replaced by the familiar quiet of your personal space. The sun may be rising or setting outside your window. You are at the threshold of sleep. It is in this quiet space that the full weight of the journey settles. The story of Sumer is not just a historical curiosity, it is a mirror. It reflects our own anxieties about the permanence of our world. We believe we are the masters of this planet, the pinnacle of its evolution. We have split the atom, walked on the moon, mapped the human genome. Our cities gleam with electric light. Our knowledge is stored in a global digital network. We feel permanent, invincible. But what if we are not? What if our civilization is just as fragile as theirs was? The younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact. We live in a cosmic shooting gallery. We know that another such impact is not a matter of if, but when. We are facing a climate crisis of our own making, a slow-motion cataclysm that threatens to flood our own coastal cities and destabilize our food supply. What would survive us? What fragments of our knowledge would a traumatized band of survivors carry into a new dark age? Would they remember our science, our art, our history? Or would it all degrade into myth? Would our astronauts become sky gods? Would our scientists become the seven sages? Would our global network become a half-remembered story of a golden age when all the world's knowledge was available at a touch? The Sumerian story is a profound and humbling cautionary tale. It is a whisper from the deep past, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can fall, and that memory is the most fragile treasure we possess. It is the story of a species with amnesia, forever dreaming of a world it can no longer remember, and in that perhaps lies the key. History is not a line, it is a cycle, and we are asleep, dreaming that we are awake. You close your eyes. The room around you dissolves. You're standing on a precipice at the edge of time. Behind you, shrouded in mist, is the lost world of the Ice Age, a civilization of impossible achievements, its cities now drowned, its science now myth. Before you, stretching out into the vastness of the future, is our own world, fragile and bright, and in between, standing at the dawn of our own historical memory, are the Sumerians. They are the bridge, the survivors, the keepers of a fading memory. All the evidence we have explored on this journey, the suddenness of their knowledge, the impossible numbers in their king lists, their sophisticated astronomy, their flood stories, their accounts of the Anunnaki, it all points to a single, profound conclusion. We have been reading our own story with the first chapter missing. History is a kind of sleep. We drift through the ages, unaware of the worlds that came before, convinced that our own fleeting dream is the only reality. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, we catch a glimpse, a fragment of a memory, a half-recalled image, a story that feels older than the language it is told in. The Sumerian records are that glimpse. They are the dream diary of a species trying to wake up. They remind us that we are part of a story far grander and more ancient than we know. They challenge us to become archaeologists of our own memory, to dig past the comfortable narratives and to search for the foundations of the world that was, the world that sleeps beneath the floodwaters of forgotten time. The clay tablets do not hold all the answers, but they teach us finally how to ask the right questions, and that perhaps is the most precious knowledge of all.